Donna, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Thank you. What a pleasure to be talking with you.
I want to begin by talking about Gloria Steinem. She turned 90 years old last week. What do you think of when you hear the name Gloria Steinem?
Gloria Steinem, she's amazing. She's accomplished so much and done so much for women. And I'm proud to say I have a speech by her in my new book. I couldn't have published this book without the voice of Gloria Steinem. She's been a unique force advancing women's position in society, women's rights, women's voice, women's well-being for so many years. It thrills me that she's celebrating her 90th birthday. And I just read not too long ago that either it was when she turned 89 or 90 that she was going on a trip to, I think it was the Zambia, somewhere in South Africa, on like a safari. But the speech I have by her in the book is called Living the Revolution, and she describes what it was like to be part of the women's revolution and why it was so important for all of us. And it was a 1970 speech she gave at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie. And that was when the women's movement was really, I mean, it was, late 60s, early 70s. It was still a fresh topic. And she really used that speech as an opportunity to talk about why it was so important to get your values right. It's really an anti-Vietnam War speech, but why it's so important to get your values right and stand up for your beliefs. So I'm a real fan of hers.
How'd you get here in terms of your upbringing, education, the like?
Get here. I was a journalist for a long time. I like to say I'm my third act. First, I was a journalist, then I worked for newspapers, magazines, even did some radio and TV producing. Then I became a speechwriter. And it was while I was working as a speechwriter for a long time, I mean, at least 10 or more years, that I started to become aware of this imbalance in the speaking world, imbalance both in the present and the past, meaning there were more men speakers than women. And not only that, but in the history books, we always talked about men speakers and not women speakers. And it offended me because I thought it can't be the case. There have to have been important women, speakers in history. So because I have an obsessive personality, I'm something of a completionist, I started buying up speech anthologies, speech collections. They used to be more popular than they are now. It used to be every household, just like they had an Encyclopedia Britannica would have speech anthologies, world's greatest speeches, speeches that change the world, words that change, words of a decade, all that kind of thing. So I started researching them and buying them and getting them from the library. And I would open them up and look in the table of contents, my little pencil, and count up how many speeches by men and how many by women. And what I found was shocking. I mean, I collected 230 speech anthologies in the English language. So I didn't look at Russian collections. I guess they exist. I didn't look at Spanish collections or French. I looked at in the English language, which means the United States, Britain, Great Britain, Ireland, South Africa, the Philippines, those kind of places. India, no speeches by women. I mean, very few. And I created an infographic. So all of your listeners can go, your audience can go online and see my infographic. How the world forgot about women's speech. Women have been speaking, but the world, just forgot about it. So that was the start of going down the rabbit hole. I mean, I really went free fall down the rabbit hole.
I wonder how long that process took you.
Years. Oh, no, I'll tell you what's interesting is that when you're really interested in something, I kind of make light of it, like I was obsessed, but it's really true. When something is your passion, when you discover something that nobody else has really looked at or examined or brought, given the sunlight that it deserves, I'm not going to say it doesn't feel like work, but I mean, I was like 24/7, up till 3 in the morning, finding speeches by women. And then, by the way, I didn't say this, I put them all into a free online archive so that anybody anywhere in the world who has access to the internet can go online and find my archive, speakingwhilefemale.co, and find thousands of speeches by women from ancient world until the present, from every country under the sun, different languages. I haven't gotten them all translated yet, but I keep finding more speeches all the time. Iconic, historic speeches by women.
This kind of endeavor seems to lend itself to being endless. I mean, you can do this forever. Have you set some sort of barometer for yourself before you stop this, or is this an endless lifetime passion?
No, people like me have no barometers. But it's always going to be my passion. But we all grow and our vision morphs and changes. And I'm interested still passionately in recovering women's speeches and in changing our understanding about who spoke in history, not just, the men, but also women and other people. But also, I think my interests have expanded also to questions of voice, how we can all use our voices more powerfully in the world. So it's not just about the past, but it's about the present and why it matters so much that we put our knowledge and ideas into the world.
Why is it so crucial to have more women as kind of experts on various subject matters? Why is it important that books like yours and projects such as yours make their way out into the light?
Well, I would say, first of all, I'm not advocating women speakers to the exclusion of men. I support all voices. I want lots of men to speak and keep speaking. And I mean men of any gender, however you define yourself. I want all people to put their ideas, their knowledge, their expertise, their passions into the marketplace of ideas. The marketplace of ideas. So the best ideas rise to the surface, because we have a heap of problems. In case you hadn't noticed, we have a lot of problems. We need the best ideas, the best thinking to go into the mix so that we can find the best solutions. So it's not exclusively women. It's just that women have been excluded. So I'm an advocate, a promoter of women's voice and other underrepresented voices. It is still true today, even though in the United States of America and other Western and advanced countries, you will find women in the news, women doing news broadcasts, women being interviewed on every subject from, prison reform to sewage control to foreign policy. Women are experts on many subjects now, but they're still not experts in the numbers that men are. They're still not speaking up in the numbers that men are for a variety of reasons. And here's how I like to put it, because I give a lot of workshops in public speaking. More women than most men still are reluctant to call themselves experts and say, I am deserving and worthy of speaking, of putting my knowledge into the world. Doesn't mean there aren't men who aren't comfortable with it. Doesn't mean there aren't lots of women who are comfortable with it, but more women than men still don't like to do that. And you still see it play out in companies across the country, in school board meetings and city hall, still far more men than women stepping up and speaking.
The work that you've done and the research that you've done has spanned centuries, right? What have you seen as it relates to the development of society through this work that you've uncovered over time?
Well, I think the answer to that would be a philosophical one, and I'm not sure that I'm a philosopher. But I do see that it takes many voices to make a world and to advance this world. I mean, for example, in my book, I'm showing you my cover. In the book, I have women who made a difference with their voices. Like, just for example, Clara Shortridge Foltz, who was the first female lawyer on the West Coast, first female lawyer in California. She fought to get there. She took her lawsuit all the way to California Supreme Court, rewrote the laws so women could take the bar exam and go to law school in California. But aside from that, she was a criminal defense lawyer, a family lawyer. She practiced a lot of different kinds of law. And while she was in the courtroom, in her own experience, she could see that the criminal defendants were getting steamrolled by the prosecutor. They didn't have a chance. A lot of them, they were indigent. A lot of them were ignorant of the law. They just didn't have a chance. The prosecutor comes in, it was a man always, a whole armamenture of laws and resources, and the criminal defendants just go to prison. And she said, there's something wrong with that. That's not aligned with our goals as a nation. You know, we believe in equal justice under law. Everybody deserves representation. And furthermore, we believe in innocence until proven guilty. So in 1894, just think about that, 1894 is a long time ago, she stood up in Chicago and gave a speech in which she argued that we needed, for all the reasons I just mentioned, a public defender system. It took 20 years, but because of her, we have a public defender system in this country, all over the country. Different jurisdictions support it. People complain about it all the time. They're under-resourced, whatever. It exists because of this woman, because of what she saw in her law practice. And you can be sure that there are lawyers and other professionals all over by the thousands who see things that are wrong and can have the expertise and the knowledge to change them if they only use their voices.
I wonder how you were able to, as a technical matter, narrow this list down to 75. I'm sure you've thought about this. I'm sure you've been asked this question a whole lot, because it's likely an impossible task. How'd you go about narrowing the list?
Painfully.
Yeah.
So what I did was I created an Excel spreadsheet, and I just started putting in, 20, 30 speeches that were just had to be there. Iconic speeches. Actually, I thought in my mind there were going to be 10 or 15, and then it grew and there were 20 and there were 30. And then I started filling in the gaps. So the earliest speech I have is 1637, Anne Hutchinson. She spoke out defending herself because the Puritan leaders of the Puritan colony didn't like her speaking about religion, and they banished her. So she tried to defend herself in court. So she's the first one. I started with her, and then I looked for other ones to fill in. I was trying to find women's voices that were representative of all the major milestones in American history. So we have pre-America, the colonial days, and indigenous women. We have women in early America. We have a woman who fought in the Revolutionary War. Then, we have earliest women speaking about women's rights, the temperance movement, anti-slavery, women speaking during the Civil War. After the Civil War, of course, the suffrage movement was heating up on every corner in every major city. We had women speaking about suffrage and temperance, of course. And then you get to the end of the 1900s, and we had women speaking about education and prison and all these kind of social reformist issues. And then we get to World War I. What's going to happen to all these women laborers who've entered the workforce when men come home from the war? Women talking about that, women talking about, the Depression. How are we going to get out of the Depression? World War II, feminist movement, the rise of the feminist movement, straight up into, civil rights era, straight up to the present. So every signal period in American history, there was a woman speaking about it. Not just that, but a woman making a powerful speech and changing the dynamic of the discourse because she was speaking up. And by the way, for the most part, they're not in the history books.
So obviously this was an extension of underrepresentation. Is your goal that women, young girls, society in general, look at this optimistically or pessimistically, if you know what I mean?
Oh, optimistically, by far. And I am an optimist. People always ask me, oh, isn't it upsetting that this, that, or the other? And I'm like, no, it is great. Just in the 20 years since I've been in the speaking world and speaking coach and doing this work, I've seen enormous change. Just think none of us would even dream of going back to 2017 before the Me Too movement. The world has changed enormously. I mean, it changes in increments. So we don't always grasp it. But look how much the world has opened up in our society for women. And I only see more opportunities and an explosion of more, down the pike if we keep emphasizing these points. And with regard to this book, this little book, I have to say that I'm so keen on it being in public libraries because I want students and scholars and teachers to have access to these primary sources. But also, I always say that if somebody has this book on their bookshelf and they don't even crack the spine, let's say they don't even pull it off the shelf for a year, but they have a little girl in the household or a young woman, and she goes by and she sees it says speaking while female, she gets the message. She gets the message that her voice matters. Because these are like amorphous ideas, that we need to deeply integrate into our own lives. But to answer your question, I think we're moving in very swiftly to a brighter future with regard to equality of voices and plurality of voices in the public sphere.
What did you learn from writing this book?
Well, I mean, that's a very complicated question. The answer is complicated. On many levels, I gained more confidence in myself in appreciating that I could speak and I could help change people's minds. I was always interested in speaking, but I don't think I didn't have a subject that really felt powerful enough to speak about. So I developed my own voice, my own sense of my ability to participate in the conversation. In a more profound, not in a more profound way, maybe that is the profound way, but I also have come to think that we should just take all the history books and throw them out and start over. Because I'm not kidding. You look at the history books or you look at this infographic that I created, how the history of speech forgot about women's speech. And it's shocking how we associate oratory with men, rhetoric with men, powerful positions in society. But that's not the only sphere. I mean, across many spheres, our default association of power and social change is male. And as I said, I welcome all the male change makers, welcome them. But I want more plurality of voices. I want a society that is more open to everybody's voices, because that's the only way that we can create positive change.
You mentioned a few times that you promote male involvement. The word feminism is kind of one of those words that's overused, and oftentimes folks use it and they don't know what it means. Is this a feminist project that you've embarked on?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a feminist project. I don't actually, to be honest, I don't really use the word feminist very much, but I would proudly use it. I think maybe I stopped using it or I never used it because feminist became a divisive term. I mean, I'm old enough to remember not so long ago, young women didn't want to be called associated with feminists. They thought that feminist was like an old fogey term. And then we had a resurgence. It was what was her name? She gave the speech, the British Nigerian writer, and she said why we should all be feminists. There was a resurgence in using the word feminist. So yes, I am 100% a feminist, but it's not as though I walk around with a pin on my lapel. Although to celebrate Gloria Steinem's 90th birthday, I would wear that pin.
I am interested. What does that word mean to you?
It means advocating for women. It's just that it doesn't mean not advocating for men. It doesn't mean advocating for women exclusively. So maybe it's a term that's lost some of its salience. I don't know. I think it's above my pay grade to tell you that. I'm a proud feminist, and I will be until the day that they put me in the grave.
When you're out making speeches, promoting your book, talking to folks, what reactions do you get from young girls, young women, as it relates to things that they now know that they may not have known in the past?
Oh, I get such, you can't believe how enthusiastic people are about this message. I speak to groups, and when I'm lucky enough to speak to young women, which actually isn't often enough, they get very excited. But what I experience more is people come up afterwards with their books and say, I want this book for my daughter. Will you sign this for my daughter? I'm buying this for my niece. She's 11. It's so important that she see this. I'm buying this for my granddaughter. So maybe that speaks to the age of the people that I'm speaking to. But, there's tremendous, tremendous enthusiasm because it's almost eye-opening when you realize that we always learned about, the Martin Luther Kings and the Winston Churchills and the Abe Lincolns and the Patrick Henrys and Mahatma Gandhis and the Frederick Douglasses and the Ronald Reagans and we just never learned about women speakers. Once in a while, someone will mention a Sojourner Truth, maybe, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, maybe. People just don't know that women played this role. And when something opens your eyes to a larger universe, it really is quite powerful.
Just to piggyback off that, how much of the need for something like this falls on schools, on academic institutions for not adjusting their curriculum, for not having class schedules based around this kind of stuff?
Oh, everything. I put it on them. I'm trying my best to get this book into every library across the country. It's in every public library and every private library. And I call on all my friends and say, will you please, do you have a library card in, Miami, Florida, or in Duluth, Minnesota? Will you please request this for your public library? And they do, and the librarians buy it right away. And that's why I'm trying to speak to library associations too, because it's essential that these books be, these speeches be available. But I put it all on the educational system. There are some teachers at the collegiate level and in high school who are using the archive as a teaching guide. C-SPAN's teaching has a teaching arm that is using it, and others are starting to use it too. For example, there's a local college where a history professor gives assignments from the speech archive. Oh, and I just spoke to a class in American University in Washington, D.C. the other day, and this teacher had assigned every student should find 2 speeches and be prepared to talk about them. So it's happening. It's just slowly. So that's why I'm calling on all your listeners and you to help me spread the word, because it takes a lot of effort to change social preconceptions, right? Or misconceptions.
I taught constitutional law for years, and you decided to focus your work on speech, right? Speech is a big deal. It's kind of one of those trigger words in our society, right? It automatically carries with it certain presumptions. How important is speech? How important as speech, not just legally and constitutionally, but for the purposes of running a free society? Why did you focus on speech rather than something else?
Oh, speech is so important. Free speech is so important. First of all, to emphasize, I have thousands of speeches in that archive. There's no way I could possibly agree with all of the speeches in there. In fact, some people say, why did you have a speech by her in there? She's awful. Or why? I have everybody's point of view in there. I believe in that passionately. We need to see all the points of view. And a free society the foundation of a free society is free speech. And that's why it's so important. The corollary to that is if we want to protect free speech, we have to encourage free speech. It's no good if we don't use it. It's a privilege we have in our societies, a constitutional privilege. And there are more people around the world who don't have that privilege. I was just reading the other day about this young man. He's in his mid-20s, and he went in Moscow to Mayakovsky Square. I think that there's a statue of Vladimir Mayakovsky, who's a Russian poet. And he read a poem against the war in Ukraine. He's in prison, multi-year prison sentence for reading a poem. And it's not just, I mean, it's Russia, it's Iran, it's China, it's all over the world. Look what's happening in Hong Kong. It's disgraceful and it's alarming. We need to protect free speech. And so absolutely my project is a project that promotes a free and open society in which everybody can and should speak their mind.
I'd like to ask, what are some of the more memorable speeches that stand out to you from your book?
Oh, that's interesting. People often ask me what's my favorite speech. And I always say I don't have a favorite because the favorite is the one that I always just added to the speech bank the night before or at 2 o'clock in the morning. But I'm going to tell you, if you'll give me 1 second. I'm looking at my list of speeches in the book to remind myself. I mentioned Anne Hutchinson at her heresy trial in 1637, but in 1781, I have the words of a Cherokee woman named Nan Yehi. Now, many people don't realize that in indigenous communities, many of them, women had positions of power and privilege and responsibility, and they spoke and they led communal meetings and they did negotiations, but virtually none of those communities, those indigenous tribes or clans, had written language. So we don't know what they said, which is an appalling thought that these women were speaking and we don't know what they said. But in 1781, Nanyehi was negotiating for her tribe with some agents of the federal government. It was in what's now Eastern Tennessee. And because these Anglo treaty negotiators were there, they wrote down what she said. They translated it and wrote it down, what she said. And actually, I think we have the Cherokee original. I'm not sure about that. I can't remember. But you have to see the picture. It's like a fragment with the words on it. And it's like browned at the edges. And it's in the Library of Congress in the Nathaniel Green papers. And that's why we have her words. So she is a stand-in or a representative of all the many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of indigenous women who've spoken, who we don't have a record of their speaking. The other thing is, very few people know this, but in America, there were hundreds of women who were itinerant preachers, and they would travel all over the Eastern Seaboard, the Northeast and the Eastern Seaboard, preaching. They were inspired by the Word of God, and they would preach against slavery, and they would speak for the Word of God, and they would speak about sin and other religious topics, but they were speaking, and they would often travel by themselves. It was dangerous, and they would speak to mixed audiences, mixed meaning not just white, but white and Black audiences. There were Black women preachers and white women preachers. They would speak to prison populations because they were on a reformist mission and they were trying to save souls. We don't think about that. We don't think of America having itinerant female, speakers, but we did. And it was because of them, they laid the groundwork. That's so important to realize, that these women started it, and because of them, other women built on them, and other women built on them. We're all on their shoulders. Even though we don't have all their words, we have their example. That's why the book is so important, because it hammers home this point that these women were our forebears, and we need to know that they contributed to the making of this nation and its values, its institutions, its ideas. I'm a real patriot, in case you can't tell.
Have you ever thought about, I'm sure you have, about a follow-up or a sequel or something that comes after this? Would it be just an extension, or would it take a different form, perhaps?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things you could do with it, but they're not really money makers, and I have to earn a living. I mean, you could create a website and you could create videos and you could create pop-up boxes and it would be a great institutional learning aid. But I mean, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of money and I have to earn a living. But I am working on a sequel. I'm just getting started of Canadian women's speeches because I call the book Extraordinary Speeches by American Women, but that's a misnomer. There's no Canadian or Latin American women in the book. So, or women from Latin America. So I have a partner, a woman who's in Canada, who's a speechwriter, and she and I want to do this together. I don't know that we'll have 75 speeches. It'll be some other number, but similarly, it will tell the story of Canada through women's voices, showing that all along women were there using their voices and speaking up.
Donna, thank you so much for your time, for your insight, for taking the time out of your day to talk to me. Where can folks find you, find out more about you, listen to you speak, and so on?
Well, the easiest way is to go to the website. You can see all the speeches. You can click away and read and watch videos to your heart's delight. Speakingwhilefemale.co. Speakingwhilefemale.co. I don't own the .com because the woman who owns it won't let it go and she's not using it. So if any of you have any special persuasion techniques, let me know. But in the meantime, until I get her to give it to me, it's speakingwhilefemale.co.
Donna, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.